Welcome back. So we spent the last session looking at the overall information. But now we need to kind of understand, in a general sense, each of these, at least synoptic gospels, before we can begin diving in to the actual texts. We need to understand the basic outline, how they work, what makes them distinct, what makes them individual versus kind of just what they each say overall. So we start from the beginning with Matthew. Who is Matthew? Sorry, I'm going to point that up more. Yep.
Tax collector.
Matthew's a tax collector. What else is he? An apostle, right? Which means he is one who works closely with Jesus while Jesus is personally present here on earth. He is like who? He is like which other gospel author in being an apostle? John, right? Whereas Mark and Luke kind of get it secondhand from somebody else, from another apostle, but still secondhand. So, seeing Matthew then, how is it that Matthew writes? What is his general structure of how he writes? Well, Matthew weaves in between two sorts of things. He weaves between narrative, so describing what Jesus is doing, and then discourse. Jesus teaching, speaking, talking. So the narrative focuses on what Jesus does. Not saying he doesn't speak there, but it's more kind of question and answer there, perhaps, or pithy little remarks. The discourses are the extensive words of Jesus, monologues, teachings, things like that. So it kind of goes in and out in Matthew's narration. There are large chunks of narrative, there are large chunks of discourse. Then further chunks of narrative, then further chunks of discourse. On and on and on until the end. How does this work, though? Matthew spends the first few chapters talking about that genealogy, and then the birth narrative. Where does this Jesus come from? Both his place in time or in history, and the immediate where he comes from. So going from his lineage to how is he born? How does he come to his parents? The narrative continues in the next few chapters with kind of the beginning of his ministry. So transitioning from the infant Christ to the adult Jesus. In Matthew's narration, we see nothing of the child. We see a newborn baby, perhaps maybe a year old, to a fully mature man walking onto the scene. It is in the beginning of the ministry that we encounter the last of the prophets, and he who is more than a prophet, John the Baptist, whom we'll talk about as we talk about this period. The one who baptizes Jesus, and then Jesus going into the desert, encountering temptations, overcoming temptations, and then beginning to preach and to teach. Though we don't encounter that teaching immediately, we encounter him calling people to follow him. That he encounters men such as James and John, Simon, Peter, and Andrew. He says, come after me, follow me. After those initial calls, we then get the first major discourse, chapters 5 through 7. The first discourse. And this is the famous Sermon on the Mount. In these three chapters, 5, 6, and 7. So this is where we will hear Jesus offer what are called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the pure of heart. Many of the major teachings that Jesus offers, or the foundational teachings, are found here in Matthew's gospel. So they're kind of immediately presented. So what is it this Jesus is preaching, teaching? Here you go. Bam. Notice, on a mount. Not fully like a mountain per se, but up of ways. Yes, sorry.
Is there like any specific like symbolism about mountains? That's like, as you said, like Moses and stuff is mountain there. Like there's always like Ten Commandments. There's always like a relationship from the mountain to Jesus, God. Could it be that because we as humans tend to see mountains as like the closest thing to heaven? Maybe that's why like there's symbolism to it.
Yes, I mean, and we'll talk about that some as we get into some of that. But Matthew highlights that kind of relation with Jesus being on the mountains as almost kind of a theophany, as if God revealing himself. Because especially in the Old Testament, the greatest encounter anyone has with God in the Old Testament is Moses on Mount Sinai. First, the burning bush, but most specifically when they escape Egypt and Moses goes up to receive the 10 Commandments. In fact, Moses, his face is so illuminated from being in the divine presence, not seeing God per se, but still being in the presence of God, that he has to hide his face because the glow is too immense for the Israelites. So for Matthew, writing in a Jewish context, this is seen as encountering God through Jesus, because he goes up on the mountain, not to encounter God, but to be the God who is encountered. We'll look at that some more as we go through the text, but that's kind of the beginning of that. Does that help? That helps in some way?
Yeah.
Good. Any other questions? No? So,
what does that say? First
so
descent?
First discourse right here is the major discourse of Matthew's gospel, the Sermon on the Mount. Some of Jesus's major teachings, including those Beatitudes. We will talk about those more when we get into, if I can write, we will talk about those more as we get into the teachings of Jesus, not just his miracles, but what he teaches. Leaving behind that first discourse, Matthew then plunges back into more narrative. Chapters 8 and 9. Filled with some healings and miracles. And it is, in fact, in the midst of this narrative that we hear how Matthew himself is called to follow Jesus. Not necessarily the same thing as being called to be an apostle, but just to follow Jesus. And we'll consider the implications of that as we dive into the call of disciples, the call of believers. After this, immediately after that call of Matthew, which is kind of near the end of 9, there is a second discourse that Jesus gives, and he gives this to those whom he sets aside as apostles. And this is often called the missionary instructions. On what they are to do in spreading the message that Jesus wants them to know, that eventually comes to be called the gospel. Matthew then flows back into narration, some looking at the figure of John the Baptist again, the arrest and the death of John, John's significance in what Jesus does and says, and even some talk of Jesus as the chosen servant in accord with the prophecies of the Old Testament, what had been foretold. He is the one who will be chosen. After discussion of this chosen servant, this one chosen by God, Matthew enters his third narrative, third discourse. I'm sorry, I'm getting them all confused. My apologies. And this is a collection of various stories that Jesus uses to teach what are called parables. What that means and how Jesus uses that, we will look into later in class. But various ones, such as the parable of the sower, a parable that Jesus himself even explains, parables such as the weeds and the wheat, the pearl in the field, and the buried treasure in the field, the pearl of great price. Then, going back into narrative, there are various miracle stories that are recalled in these chapters, 14 through 17. Events such as Jesus feeding thousands of people miraculously, and walking on water. His gathering together of some of his disciples, his healing of disputes and arguments. Along with this one, the particular episode of the name change of Simon is one of his apostles giving him the name of Peter, the significance behind that. And the episode known as the Transfiguration. An event where Jesus seems to show himself, or show some of who he really is, and allow it to shine through, as it were. Now, to try to keep it. Everybody have this so far? Oh, sorry, yes.
Can you explain more the Transfiguration thing?
We'll talk about that more as well, but this is an episode where Jesus takes some of his closest disciples up to a mountain, and he seems to radiate with this immense, intense light coming from him. And then encountering two of the great Old Testament figures, Moses and Elijah, then hearing a voice say, "This is my son," We'll look at that in some more detail as we go through the gospel as well. But that is just kind of placing it in the general flow of the work. That's where that episode happens.
What does that say next to missionary?
So I'm to remember if you need to, you always, as long as it's working, you can go back to the recording to be able to
Start erasing it.
see
That's
if you
cool
missed
too.
any of that. So after that, Matthew offers his fourth discourse. These are kind of community. Sorry, I forgot the community instructions. How this community of believers that he has gathered, how are they to treat one another? How are they to live? Not just individually, but as a community. Understanding and overcoming temptations against the belief, the teachings that Jesus exemplifies. Especially offering mercy teachings, how to forgive, what it means to forgive. There is then, after that, what could be described, as it were, as the final journey of Jesus to Jerusalem.
Is that narrative or discourse?
That is narrative, yes. So that was discourse. 18 was discourse. This is narrative. And even his entry into Jerusalem, which begins the last days of his life. And appropriately, the last major discourse Matthew has happening in these last days of Jesus' life, as recalled in the gospel, the fifth discourse, the fifth and the final discourse, is known as the eschatological sermon. Eschatological means in reference to the last days, the last things of this universe. In the Catholic tradition, that means in particular death, judgment, heaven, and hell. So about the end, chronologically, and in a certain sense maybe teleologically, of humanity, where it is all heading towards. It seems most appropriate to hear and to have Jesus describe this as he is looking at his own last days, which in this narrative he seems to understand is happening very soon. This leads then into the last chapters of Matthew's Gospel, 26 through 28, which are the narratives of Jesus' passion, his death, and his resurrection. And it pretty much goes in a kind of day-by-day order. 26 is the day before his death, when he celebrates his Last Supper, goes to pray in the garden, is betrayed and arrested. 27 is the last day of his life, what is commemorated as Good Friday in the Christian calendars, where he is brought before the Jewish High Council, is charged with blasphemy, condemned by them, taken to the Roman governor, They convince the Roman governor to execute him. He is tortured. He is dragged out of the city. He is crucified. He suffers for a period of about 3 hours and then dies on the cross and is buried. 28 is what happens on the first day of the week. After the Sabbath, the day of rest, the Jews, the encounter with the empty tomb and the encounter with the risen Jesus. Not just alive, but more alive than even when he was alive. And ending with his last appearances among his disciples and what is known as the Great Commission. That he commands his apostles, his church, his community of believers to go out and to preach to all the nations. Now, and this outline of narrative and discourse is not something that is necessarily made up in a scholarly way, like somebody goes up and, oh, it looks like narrative is new. This comes from the text itself. Almost every time that a discourse is completed, Matthew will write in some way. He says, when Jesus had finished saying these things. So he is blocking these sayings together. He wants it to be read in this way. Sometimes scholarly analysis can just read too much into text. This is plainly evident from the text. He will say, at the end of this last discourse, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he began to do this. This happened. So that's kind of the general breakdown of Matthew's gospel. Now, what was Matthew's major theme? Anybody recall? What was Matthew's major theme?
Fulfillment of Jewish scripture.
That's correct. How is it that he does this? How is it Matthew shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of Jewish scripture? He first of all will do it with what come to be called fulfillment formulas. Or formulae, if you want to be Latin-y. That there are at least a dozen times that Matthew uses this fulfillment formula. Trip myself up. He'll say something like, all this, whatever happened before, whatever action or event or thing Jesus did, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet so-and-so. Or we'll cite the text. We'll fulfill the prophet, we'll fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet saying so-and-so. And like I said, not just saying, as Isaiah says in 53, verse 4 or something. No, Matthew quotes the text usually, or says, what the prophet Isaiah or what the prophet Jeremiah had said. He does this at least a dozen times. And there's even an instance in Matthew's text where Jesus says this about himself. And he says he has to do something, that there is something that must be fulfilled. He must do something that must be fulfilled. He even says it Matthew has him say that in the midst of his arrest. Do you not know what the scriptures say that the Son of Man must be betrayed? When they tried to oppose his arrest on Thursday night. Not only does Matthew do this in these fulfillment formulas, but also references to Old Testament figures. The numbers of times that Matthew will make reference to Old Testament figures. The one he does the most, David, 17 times. Next, he does the great prophet Elijah, 9 times. I read that right. Yep. He references Moses 7 times. And gives to various others at least 13 times. And some could be, there are more that could be implied in one way or the other.
Just out of curiosity,
Sure.
with all these writings by in the Gospels and by his disciples, did Jesus ever do any writings himself?
There's only one time in any of the Gospels that we ever hear Jesus write anything. And that is an episode in the Gospel of John that Jesus is said to have written in the sand or in the dirt. We don't even know what he wrote. It could be necessarily John just saying he's playing in the dirt, or maybe he is actually writing, but John never says what he wrote. And you will hear many commentators who would say, oh, maybe he's writing this, maybe he's writing that. We don't know what he wrote. You can say whatever you want. We don't know. There are no writings that are directly attributed to Jesus. What we have comes to us is second hand from those who were close to him, those who were around him. So, believe me, everybody would love to have, Jesus wrote this himself. There is no evidence, none, of him writing anything himself, as in him picking up something and writing something. Now, of course, when we especially understand what the implications of John says in his prologue, let alone in his gospel, in a certain sense, we can say Jesus is also really the one who is the author of all the scriptures. But that's a different dialogue. In a basic outline, no, we have no writings of Jesus. There are none. There has never been any serious claim of anyone having any writings of Jesus. So if you can hop in your time machine and get Jesus to sign off on your little receipt and bring it back to me, I will give you an A+. So get cracking. One other way that Matthew shows Jesus to be the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures of the Old Testament is the immense abundance of references to Old Testament texts. And of course, he does it in these fulfillment formulas. Of course, he does it with this Old Testament figures. But there are at least 60 different references or quotations, direct quotations, at least from the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. There are numerous references back, more so than the other Gospels. I'm not saying the other Gospels don't have this, but Matthew is just bursting at the seam with them. I mean, he is going to hit you over the head until you absolutely understand this is the Messiah. This is the Christ foretold by the scriptures, by the Old Testament. He's going to make you believe it, or you're just going to be so numb from being hit over the head with it, you're going, all right, fine. Now, as part of this major theme of Matthew's fulfillment of Jewish scripture, he has kind of a sub-theme, and we saw that in his opening passage, where he highlighted Jesus as being the son or the descendant of two Old Testament figures. Anybody recall who those two Old Testament figures were? Look back at your sheet and find out.
David and Abraham.
Halfway there. Abraham. Correct. Good job. Remember, Matthew opens his gospel, the genealogy of Jesus the Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Why does he pick these two figures? First, Abraham. Abraham is the oldest figure in the genealogy. So he is the, I guess you could say he is the root of the tree. And it goes down from Abraham all the way to Jesus. Abraham is the first person that God seems to truly speak to face, to speak to individually. Coming down and encountering and meeting him. Abraham is also the most perfect believer of God in the Old Testament. God tells Abraham to pack everything up and to move to this foreign land. Abraham doesn't. God tells Abraham that he will have a son, even though he's in his 90s, even though his wife has been barren and not born him a son, he believes it. God tells Abraham, and even though he's made the promise through this only son that Abraham has, to take his son up and to offer him as a sacrifice, Abraham doesn't, and is only stopped by the angel when the angel says, that's enough. So Abraham is seen as the fullest, truest believer and the truly most righteous, most just of all the Old Testament figures, more so even than Moses, as important and influential as Moses is. Abraham is higher than that, greater than that. So in essence, he's saying that he is a son of Abraham. In fact, perhaps implying that he is the true son of Abraham who will be sacrificed instead of the immediate son, Isaac. David, of course, is the greatest of the kings. He is the one who truly unites Israel, all the tribes, all the peoples together. The peak, as it were, the full greatness of the Israelite kingdom is during the reign of David. And God had promised David that he would have a king he would have a son who would be a king who would rule forever. Of course, many of them thought that was David's immediate son Solomon. That didn't happen to be true. But he is seen as being the son of David, as the one who will truly inherit this kingship and will reign truly forever. The best way that comes out is not when he's an adult, but when he's a newborn child. In that birth narrative, that highlights how Jesus is born, it's Matthew's narrative that tells us about the Magi, the wise men who seek this newborn king. They call him a king because he is the true son of David, not Herod, Jesus. So that is how Matthew organizes and begins to and utilizes his story, his narration, his biography, his text, to say what he wants to say about Jesus. Now, of course, the next author does things a little bit different. What is perhaps the most highlighted feature of Mark's gospel? how short it is. While Matthew and Luke are filled with the teachings of Jesus, Mark has noticeably fewer discourses, noticeably fewer teachings. I'm not saying they don't exist, but there are far more absences than in the other two. Mark seems to be more concerned with what Jesus does, his actions. And we can see that right away. He jumps into, he doesn't really have an introduction. He really has the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. We don't encounter baby Jesus, little baby Jesus in his golden diapers. We don't encounter him there. We encounter the fully grown man coming straight out into public. We encounter John the Baptist again, but really in most of chapter 1, it's just Mark's like, beginning of the gospel. Here we go. Let's go. John's here. John baptizes. Jesus goes out in the desert. All right, now it's time to go. He's just getting along. Just the facts. He spends kind of the first half of his narrative, so from kind of midway through chapter 1 till almost the end of chapter 8, as kind of his various ministries and any various teachings that he offers. So he starts off Jesus' ministry with what comes to be called 5 conflict stories. Where Jesus seems to encounter this group that does not like or is displeased with what he's doing, with what he's teaching. And each of them builds up the tension to the point that by the end of the 5th one, and this is based the beginning of chapter 3 is when these conflict stories end. By that point, and we're still pretty early in Mark's narrative, they want to kill Jesus. There's already this group. We need to kill him. We need to get rid of him. He needs to be gone. So Mark, instead of a nice simmer, a nice little thing, he just turns it up and just lets that thing boil hard. And it boils pretty quickly. So we already see antagonism against Jesus early on in Mark's gospel. We will see that in the other ones, but like I said, Mark, he just turns that blaze up as hot, as fast, as quickly as possible. We're already ready to kill him. Obviously, it doesn't succeed. Obviously, it doesn't happen at this point in the narration, but it will happen. We do get some of Jesus' teachings. We do get some of the parables. Nowhere near as many as the others, but we do encounter them. But then, kind of in this back half of chapter 8, through kind of the end of chapter 13, so from kind of transitioning from ministry and teaching to being more publicly acclaimed as what he is, and this is Mark portraying Jesus as the Messiah. This salvific figure who plays an essential role in Old Testament prophecies. Excuse me. So we begin to see in here, Jesus turned to Jerusalem. Jesus began to head towards Jerusalem. His actions exemplifying what he is about to do. And even in the midst of this, we see, for example, 3 various passion predictions. Where Jesus makes a prediction about what is going to happen to him, that he will be betrayed, he will be tortured, he will be killed, and he will rise again. He always adds that. So he makes the prediction. His disciples, in each of these 3 times, there are 3 of these predictions, each of these times, they don't understand. They seem to be like, what do you mean? We're not going to do that, Jesus. How could you say that? We would never do that. And then Jesus offers some teaching in association with that. Usually that teaching is on the cost of discipleship, how hard it is to be a disciple of Jesus. Remember why is Mark writing? It's implied in much of that, to encourage those who are suffering trials and persecutions, who are suffering these things.
Do any of those talk about the Last Supper? Guess not.
Jesus then enters into Jerusalem, similar kind of to Matthew's narrative. Some of the episodes of his entry is pompous, as it were, and pomp and circumstance entry into Jerusalem. His actions there, he offers what's called an eschatological discourse as well, though a little bit shorter. And then it ends with Mark's own passion and resurrection narratives. So chapter 14, what happens on Thursday night, the Last Supper and the betrayal. Chapter 15, his condemnation by the Jewish High Council, his condemnation by the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, his torture, his execution, his crucifixion, his death, his burial. Chapter 16, his resurrection. Now, what was the theme of Mark's gospel?
Keeping a secret.
The messianic secret, yes. You're right, keeping secrets. But what is being kept secret? That Jesus is the Messiah. This is how the word gets transliterated from the Hebrew. Its translation, as I said before, into Greek is Christos. This is why we call him Jesus Christ. Christ is not his last name. Do not refer to him as Mr. Christ or the Christ household.
I'm going to be honest, I had no idea.
No, I understand. Some people don't. That's fine. That's why we have this class, so you can understand that. It is a title. It comes from both of them. This is a translation of what Messiah really means. It means the anointed one. the anointed one. Now, anoint, in a general sense, is to apply oil. This is often seen in many religions as having a rather symbolic or mystical meaning. In the Jewish meaning, to be anointed or to be called the anointed one, Messiah, the Christos, is the one chosen by God to be in some way a savior. Now, there were various misinterpretations. Remember, we talked about the various groups of the Jews, of the Jewish peoples. Talked about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. Each of them had their own idea of what the Messiah would do. Now, for many of them, the Messiah was a political figure, a king-like figure. God would send this Messiah in that particular understanding. God would send this Messiah. He would raise an army. He would push the foreign armies out of the Holy Land, the Promised Land, and he would inaugurate the new and, as it were, everlasting reign of the kingdom of Israel. So many saw the Messiah in a very political way. Jesus does not act or work towards that end. Hence, why it is he never wants people to call or to reveal him to be the Messiah. Why? Because he does not want them to follow him in this way. That's not the type of Messiah or Christos he is to be. Well, there is some truth in having a political part to it. It is more than that. It is not just limited in a political sense. So if he heals someone, he'll tell them, don't say anything. Go and show yourself to the priest. If the demons, whom he exorcises, whom he drives out of people, the demons scream out, you are the Holy One of God. He says, be quiet, go. He can do that. He has the authority to do it. He doesn't want people to have this false concept or these over-exaggerated expectations of what the Messiah is. Because he has in mind what he is to be, to do. So, he even does this to his own disciples. He asks them, who do you say that I am? One of them, Simon Peter, says, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah. He says, don't tell anybody. Not a word. Not till I'm done, he says. So Mark has this rather secretive Jesus, and also, because as we just talked about in the outline, by the beginning of the 3rd chapter, they want to kill him. They're already so driven mad by what he does, what he says, how he acts, that his opponents want to kill him. So you could say, in a real sense, he is trying to avoid inciting any further anger. Because if he comes out and says, well, yeah, I'm the Messiah, they're really going to let loose. They're probably really going to do that. They already are chomping at the bit to try to get rid of him.
But then they call for, didn't the Old Testament say that there would be a Messiah? Is it because it's not the Messiah they were expecting?
Exactly. He is not what they are expecting. As we will see in looking at the opposition to Jesus, he is not what many of them, in particular the Pharisees, expect in their Messiah. He seems to be undoing everything. And they can't handle that. Some other traits or characteristics of Mark's gospel. Mark's is filled with a sense of immediacy. What do I mean by that? Not only is Mark's the shortest, but it really does feel like Mark is taking you on a crash course tour of the life of Jesus. We got a flight in 2 hours. We got to get through this really fast. We got to get going. No stops, no breaks. You can hold it until the end. Got to get going. The way that he shows us most is he keeps using the word immediately. Outhis in Greek. He uses this word 42 times. Now he will write, kaiuthus, and immediately this happened, and immediately this happened, and immediately that happened. It's like, Mark, get off the coffee. Get off the caffeine. Like take a breath. It's okay. We got some time. He's just constantly just going and going and going. And trying to read this, you're like, yeah, you can take some time, but at the same time, you're like, man, I really did breeze through that whole period in nothing. Mark is also, perhaps due to his poor understanding of Greek, he repeats himself. Not just reusing terms, but reusing phrases. Like I said, maybe it's because his Greek is so bad, he's just meaning and then. But it comes across as and immediately and right after this. Maybe he's being intentional. It's hard to tell. But he can be rather repetitive. Just kind of highlight, Control C, Control V. That's the easy way to copy and paste, by the way. They teach you all how to do that?
Yes.
That's good. Keys are much better than the mouse at times. Just copy, paste, copy, paste, copy, paste. Like you might try to do when trying to finish up your next reading journal due by the end of the week. It's coming up. But Mark's gospel also has to it, despite this immediacy and this repetition, a great sense of realism. Though Mark is not filled as much with teaching, his narrative, his narration, his style has in it a great amount of realism. It can at times, it can feel more real to read it, although sometimes that can be lost in translation. For instance, the first way is what is called the historical present. If you remember, maybe you don't, I don't know whether they teach grammar as well anymore, there are various tenses to verbs that tell us when the verb happened. Past tense can say it's in the past, whether it's continuing to happen in the past or it happened in the past and it's done in the past. Or it's coming up, it's in the future, it's yet to happen. Or, of course, the present. I am standing here. You are sitting there. You on the video are watching this. That's the present tense. We would normally expect in a narration talking about events in the past that they would use the past tense. I spoke these words. For you watching this on the video, this all happened in the past. I stood here, I said these words, because most likely at the time you're watching this, it's not happening. You all, or who are the students in here in class, you sat down, you took notes, you asked questions, the past tense. Why? Because it happened in the past. It's done. Yet Mark writes, more often than not, in the present tense. So he won't say Jesus said this, or Jesus did this. He will speak more like, and Jesus is saying, or Jesus says. Jesus is doing, or Jesus does, present tense, does this. And it can feel as if you're there. You're almost like kind of reading along or watching some sort of a play or a movie. Right? They more often than not don't do those things in the past tense. Luke, I was your father. No, he speaks in the present. Luke, I am your father. It's the same with Mark's gospel, historical present. There is also not just this historical present, but what can feel like a very realistic reaction to what Jesus says and does. A very realistic reaction. There is one point early on in chapter 3 where Jesus' family comes to get him. Because the implication is they think something's wrong with him. Oh, he's such a nice boy. I don't know why he's saying all these things about being dying and being crucified and all that. Oh, he's been in the sun too much. He just needs to go and lay down. Get some rest, get some water. His disciples often don't understand. Just sitting there going, huh? What? What did he say? What did he mean? Or they're just very weak. And they're just kind of, okay, Jesus, if you really think so. You would almost at times expect this from someone speaking and acting in this way. You wouldn't expect just, people to just go, oh, yes, you're right, you're true. You would think and expect people to think, he's crazy, he's weird, why is he speaking like this? How is he doing any of this? It feels more realistic. The other ones can seem rather pious. Everyone just accept the enemies of Jesus. That kind of accepts. But no, Mark's is more real. It's like it's hard for people to understand. Hard for people to go, like what? Like, okay, that's weird. But he's doing these cool things, so I guess there must be some truth to it. Another way that Mark brings this out is what are known as Aramaisms. These are words that are not translated, but come to us straight from the Aramaic language, which is the more recent form of Hebrew. Or perhaps you could say a more devolved form. So for example, how many of you have heard the term Romance languages? What are the Romance languages? What's one of them? French. Spanish. Others? Italian. Why are they called Romance languages? They're called Romance languages because they are derived ultimately with influence from perhaps other cultures. They are derived from Latin, which was the language of Rome, the Roman people. So there are similarities between Latin, the ancient language of Rome, and these modern languages. That though they come later, they are derived from it. Aramaic is kind of in the same sense. It's derived from Hebrew. It's a living language that derived. So Mark, whether because he is from there, because perhaps his Greek may be poor, he often does not translate these terms or these names. So he will use some such as, for example, Beelzebub. That's not Greek, that's Aramaic. The phrase Talitha Kum or Koum, which he will still translate, but he will still use it. Talitha Kum, little girl, rise, arise. Rabboni, more derived form of rabbi, right? Master or teacher. Mark will do this quite a bit in trying to it makes it feel more real, that it's coming. It's not like a translation of a translation. It's like, no, it's coming straight to us as almost from the source. Sorry.
And that's instead of Greek, he's using those Aramaic terms.
He transliterates it, so he puts it into Greek, so that, but it's not a Greek word. Those are not Greek. Matthew will often translate those ideas. So he won't use Aramaic or Hebrew words. He will translate them. But Mark more often than not just puts them straight over. He's like, I don't know. That's
so he uses Greek letters to spell out the words?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Well, just like I did.
Yeah.
Well, I used Latin, English letters. That's not the letters Aramaic or Hebrew uses. So that's transliteration instead of translation. So transliteration is when you keep the sounds, but you try to put it into your own alphabet. Like when many cultures today apply English terms, because they're so common. That many of the Easterners, Japanese and Chinese, have done this a lot. They won't translate a term; they'll transliterate it, so they pronounce it in their own phonetic way. They keep the word; they don't just transform it. So, I think instead of running through Luke, I'll save him for next class, next session. Questions, comments on any of that? An overview for the gospel table or the outline for Matthew and Mark? All right. Be sure to finish up your next reading journal that is due the end of the day, Friday. If you are having issues with that, please let me know. It's working on the sense of Scripture in an Old Testament sense. So get that done. The, what's it called? The next participation assignment should be available by Wednesday morning at 9. The videos should be up if you need those as well. So work on that. We'll check out the next assignment, the next readings and stuff. We'll get back and talk about it more next class.